Snow White is Disney's latest live-action remake, so was it as bad as everybody thought? Let's talk about it. Hey everyone, John Lunsford here, and we now have a live-action remake of Disney's original princess, Snow White. I will get into spoilers here, but it's also a remake of a movie from 1937, which itself is based off an 1812 fairy tale, so if you haven't been spoiled after 200 years, well, good for you. So we all know the classic story of Snow White. A young, kind-hearted princess lives with her evil stepmother who's queen. One day Snow White meets a prince and they fall in love, and at that point, the evil queen's magic mirror says that Snow White is now the fairest of them all, so the queen wants her dead. She tries to get her huntsman to do it, but he can't bring himself to, so Snow White flees into the forest. She runs into a house in the woods where 7 dwarves live, and they become friends and sing and dance and live happily ever after. However, the queen is still mad, so she creates a poison apple that will put Snow White into a death-like sleep, poses as an old woman, and fools Snow White into eating the apple. Only true love's kiss can wake her, so her Prince Charming is sad, visits her, kisses her, and everyone lives happily ever after that. So that's the basic story. It's a story that stood for a long time and inspired so many stories we've had since then. Then we get to this version of the story. One of the biggest stories surrounding this film was how the 7 dwarves would be handled. There was some criticism from people like Peter Dinklage over it being a backwards story, so Disney decided to not cast actual actors in the role. Instead, they were animated and placed in the real world that the film took place in. It was a bit jarring, but honestly, it wasn't as weird as I thought it would be. I think they all looked pretty cartoon accurate, and I think you get used to it pretty quickly. You know how when you watch a computer animated film from like Pixar or something, and you see how far technology has advanced from when they started with Toy Story until now? Well, this looked like technology maybe advanced a little further, and they tried to make it more of a photorealistic look while staying true to the old cartoon. The only problem was that nobody else was like that. They also had to CGI all the creatures because actual woodland creatures wouldn't just hang out around people like that. So I think that actually added to the dwarves not being that off in the movie to me. But the CGI dwarves were the least of my problems with the film. First, Gal Gadot is not good in this. I like Rachel Zegler, and I think she's had some good roles. I loved Spielberg's remake of West Side Story. I thought she was really good in the Hunger Games prequel as well. You have to get the title character right, and while some people criticize the casting of a Latina actress, I thought she was great in the role. But Gal Gadot was not. It has nothing to do with her off-screen issues. She's just not very good. Her singing didn't really fit. Her accent was all over the place, disappearing sometimes and then coming back other times. Every time she was in a scene, it just kind of was ruined. Next, there's no Prince Charming. Instead, he's replaced by a character named Jonathan who's just a thief. Now, my name is Jonathan, so I can definitely see how they would confuse the term Prince Charming with Jonathan. But Snow White's first interaction with Jonathan is him stealing potatoes from the castle. He's kind of more of a Robin Hood character than a prince. And the queen has him strung up in the city. Snow White frees him, and they eventually meet in the forest again, and Jonathan turns out to be the leader of a group of bandits, so it ends up being Snow White and the 7 dwarves and the 7 bandits. It just makes no sense. While in the woods, her and Jonathan sing a song together, and they fall in love. It seems like part of the reason they got rid of Prince Charming was so that there wasn't the stereotypical trope of like, the prince has to save the princess, but instead, that aspect of the story still essentially plays out the same. Snow White eats the apple, falls into her death-like sleep, and then once Jonathan and the huntsman work together to break out of prison, he journeys to the dwarves in the forest, sees Snow White, and rescues her with a kiss. So it kind of plays out the same, just instead of the good old story of Snow White and Prince Charming living happily ever after, Snow White and Jonathan live happily ever after. Also in the original Snow White, the dwarves and woodland creatures chase the queen to a cliff after she gives the apple to Snow White. She ends up falling off to her death, and then the prince comes and wakes her up. Well, I guess they thought that was too gruesome for this, so instead, Snow White gets woken up and goes to talk to everybody and convinces them all to be good and not follow the evil queen anymore, which somehow works, and makes the queen fly off the handle, destroy her magic mirror after it tells her that Snow White will always be fairer than her, and that kills her. The story changes just don't make a lot of sense. If you watch my video on the best live action remakes, you heard me criticize The Lion King for not doing enough to make it its own unique movie and instead being close to a shot-for-shot remake. When I say I want films to be fresh, I mean let's add some new songs in there, which this film does, or maybe let's change some scenery or some costume changes or something, but I don't mean take away major characters and totally butcher plot points. Prince Charming is one of the biggest characters of all time. How many times have you seen that name be used for things? And you totally cut him out for a bandit named Jonathan who still has to come to Snow White's rescue. All in all, the movie wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen, but it was far from great. It's just kind of a lukewarm telling of a classic story. I'm going to say this one is just, well, all right. I won't put it in awful territory, but any positive it has is overshadowed by negatives. I think going in, I had about as low of expectations as I could have, and maybe that made it where it wasn't quite that bad. It just didn't really come together to be a cohesive film. I think they need to leave the old films behind, let them be legendary, and focus more on remakes from films from the early 90s on, like The Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin, if they're going to do them. I am looking forward to Lilo and Stitch. It looks pretty good, and to see how they do Moana, but Snow White probably needs to go back to her death-like sleep, and we'll all remember her fondly. So what did you think of the film? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Is it kind of in the middle and lukewarm and you'll forget about it like me? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to subscribe to the Pop Culture Life for more movie reviews, TV show recaps, and so much more.